So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our opening keynote, Professor Dorothy Roberts, who, I don't think anybody in this room thinks she needs an introduction. Um, Paved the way for our movement and our analysis and our activism, but I'll just share a few words to remind folks. So, Dorothy Roberts is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor and George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in the departments of Africana Studies and Sociology and the Law School, where she is the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mosul Alexander Professor of Civil Rights. She's also the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society, and a MacArthur Genius Fellow. Okay. An internationally acclaimed scholar and social justice activist. Roberts is author of the award-winning Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, and Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families, and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. As well as more than 100 articles and book chapters. Recent recognitions of her work include elections to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Academy of Medicine, Juvenile Law Center Leadership Prize, Bronx Defenders Ally in Pursuit of Justice Award, and Abortion Liberation Fund of Pennsylvania Rosie Jimenez Award. So I'd like to welcome Professor Roberts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I see when you stand here and you can see everybody all at once. This is such an amazing group. I think just us, and I'm going to try to resist saying hi to everybody that I see out there. It's just almost speechless looking out at all of you and how we've come together in this such an important moment where our work is more needed than ever. And I almost feel like I don't need to say anything because just us being together it's really a miraculous achievement. I was just talking with someone outside about how even 10 years ago, you couldn't have brought this group together. How 20 years ago, saying you were a family defender, you were afraid to say it because people would accuse you of supporting child abuse. Just imagine how much we've been able to do together just in a decade, in 5 years. And that is why we know we're going to win. We know, right? It's from our ancestors who struggled to abolish enslaving human beings. Indigenous people struggles to end so-called Indian wars and create treaties. Yes, they have been completely violated by this nation, but they continue to struggle. And we now recognize the importance of that struggle to all of our struggles. I could go on just thinking about the victories that we've had. I say often to people when they ask me, how do you keep at this work you've been doing, for decades? And it seems like at this point, so many achievements we made have been demolished by court decisions. We can't even imagine what this new administration, just thinking about the cabinet appointments, it's almost unthinkable. But the reason why I know, and I think many of you can keep going, is because of each other, right? Because we have a commitment and a vision and a faith and a hope that our work means something and will achieve something. And we know that it does. I always say to people, we don't just come together to cry, even though, believe me, if I if I wasn't standing here and holding back the tears, I'd be crying right now out of joy, not out of. But we don't just sit around complaining and crying. We celebrate. That's why I love the reproductive justice movement, because we celebrate when we have victories, and that's, for me, what keeps me going and gives me the hope and commitment and faith that we are going to win this battle, battle by battle, piece by piece, step by step, increment by increment, but we're going to continue to move toward justice. So, and thank you to all the sponsors, the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice, Movement for Family Power, If, When, How, and the Gender Journal, and all who made this convening possible. So as the opening speaker, I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the foundation for breaking down silos, to talk about the way in which the silos are actually not separate movements, separate injustices or separate movements to overcome them, how they're intersecting the politics around all the aspects of reproductive justice, whether we're talking about abortion or pregnancy criminalization or family policing. They are all deeply entangled. You cannot understand the politics of one without taking into account the politics of the other. And then I think the rest of this convening will be talking about figuring out how, from our various positions, we can work together, from our various movements, we can work together, understanding that foundation. So I'm not going to be giving a lot of recommendations and proposals. My idea here is to talk about the intersecting politics from which we will then talk about what we need to be doing to break down the silos of reproductive justice. Okay. So when many people still today think of reproductive rights, they think of one thing, and that's the right to abortion. Now, of course, we are in a moment where the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, the constitutional protection for the right to terminate a pregnancy. And we see that the impact around the nation is increasing restrictions. Although, one of the bright things from the recent election is that there were states that passed laws to secure the right to abortion, despite how the presidential election turned out and how the congressional elections turned out as well. But we in the reproductive justice movement have known for a long time that focus on the right to abortion and just the legal right not to be prevented from having an abortion, that never included the right to the resources you need to get one. So just that narrow approach of Roe versus Wade was completely inadequate, and that it prioritized the interests of the most privileged people in the nation and obscured the experiences of Black, Latina, Indigenous, and other marginalized women and other people capable of bearing a child, and whose childbearing was socially devalued. So the idea that reproductive rights only entail the right not to be prevented from having an abortion completely left out all the violations of the right to childbearing, of people whose childbearing was thought to be not only devalued, but it shouldn't even happen. Shouldn't even happen. It also left out the experiences of families that have been torn apart by the so-called child protection services. And I know everybody in this room has a story they could tell, but I'll just tell one story that was live streamed over Instagram so that the whole nation could see what was going on. And this is the family of Tyrone Denier and Saisha Mercado, who were pulled over on a highway in Florida by Manatee County sheriffs, armed officers, as they drove with their newborn baby, only days old. And they were told to get out the car and hand over their baby to these armed officers. Well, actually, to the caseworkers. You could see them in the picture, the white caseworkers who were backed up by the police. As Joyce McMillan says, some cops are called caseworkers, and that's exactly, they work hand in hand. They work hand in hand, and they act like them, too. Now, why would these caseworkers take this woman's baby, who was perfectly healthy, nursing, no harm whatsoever, evidence of harm, nobody alleged any harm that she had made to her baby, because while she was pregnant with the baby, she had gone to a hospital to get help with transitioning her toddler from breastfeeding to solid food, so she'd be prepared to nurse the new baby. And instead of helping her, the hospital staff called the child abuse hotline on her, alleging that the toddler was failing to thrive. Okay, so she went to get help so he would thrive, and instead of helping him, they called the family police on her, and she had to keep the child at the hospital. She lost custody of her toddler. So now when she has the new baby, she's on the radar, right, of the family policing system. And a judge issued a pickup order to come and pick up the newborn because she's been labeled a neglectful mother, even though absolutely no evidence that she was neglectful with either of the children, but they're certainly not with that newborn. And she's screaming. You could see her on the of course, why are you taking my baby? My baby's healthy. How are you going to feed my baby? They don't care. They took the baby. Now, fortunately, because she was a contestant on American Idol, that helped get notoriety to the case, but also because this was live streamed, she got a band of lawyers, including Benjamin Crump, to support her, and she got her children back. But so many parents, as you all know, are under those same circumstances, and they don't have a high-powered lawyer, and they don't have the nation's attention, and their children stay for years and years and years in this system. And that is a violation of their reproductive freedom, just as much as it would be a violation if she was forced to have that baby, right? So somebody said to me, I hope this isn't too theoretical a conference. And I said, I don't think it will be, because I see a whole lot of people who are doing the work on the ground. But I just want to put in a little bit of theory here. Was that you, Corey? Somebody. Anyway, because, theory is also important, because there's a theory behind the work that we do, right? We don't just stay at the level of theory, though. But the theory I want to emphasize is the theory of Black feminism, and how Black feminists have always pointed to the interlocking nature of systems of oppression. So, for example, the Combahee River Collective issued this celebrated statement in the 1970s about how systems of racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression were all interlocking, integrated, and we should recognize that, and our practice should be based on that. And part of that idea of interlocking systems of oppression should also be an understanding that the practices that support those interlocking systems of oppression, the systems and institutions and practices and ideologies, the ways of thinking, all of those are also interlocking, right? Breaking down the silos. This is about breaking down the silos. We cannot keep these systems in silos, nor the policies and the practices that uphold them in silos, both because they're interlocking, we have to address them that way, but also because it makes our movement stronger when we understand that we have a common vision, because we're fighting a common enemy, a common way of thinking, a carceral logic that supports all of these systems, hierarchies that support all of these systems that we're working to abolish. So the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, although it is viewed as a decision overturning the right to terminate a pregnancy, overturning the right to abortion, and a specific decision, Roe versus Wade, it actually highlights unmistakably how these forms of reproductive oppression are interlocking, compelling people to give birth against their will, bans on abortion, criminalizing pregnancy, and family policing. And so what I want to talk about now is how we could see, in part by what's highlighted by Dobbs and its aftermath, how all of these forms of reproductive oppression are entangled, and in ways that Roe did not even pay any attention to. So the idea that all we're about is putting Roe back in place? No. Roe was completely inadequate. It did nothing for major aspect, even for as I said, even for freedom for an abortion, it didn't really support that, let alone criminalization of pregnancy and family policing. So the court, first of all, in Dobbs, completely ignores how forced reproductive labor and forced family separation were entwined during the slavery era, and were also the focus of the abolitionist movement to dismantle those forms of reproductive servitude, which were then enshrined in the 14th Amendment, which the Supreme Court had the nerve to say didn't protect reproductive freedom when it was passed in order to protect reproductive freedom. So during the slavery era, enslaved women's reproduction was under the legal control of enslavers. Now, of course, enslaved women resisted, but legally they had no right to make any decisions about their bodies because their bodies were legally owned as chattel property. And their children, from the moment of conception, were owned by the enslavers who enslaved them. And when the children were born, the enslavers had the right to do whatever they wanted. That is the origin of family separation in America, is the separation of enslaved families at the will, for any reason, of enslavers. And so compelled pregnancy and family separation were deeply and inextricably entangled in the slavery system. Not only that, they upheld the slavery system. It was essential to continuing enslaving African people to own their children and have authority over their children in order to propagate the assets, the supposed human assets of enslavers. So again, to say that the abolition of slavery and the amendments of the Constitution that enforced that, the 13th and 14th Amendments, didn't protect reproductive freedom, it's ahistorical. It's absurd. It's the opposite of what the Constitution provides. But we're seeing, when I look at the news today, it's like everything is the opposite of what it should be. Matt Gaetz being the attorney general, that's the opposite. Someone under investigation for sex trafficking children is put as the highest law enforcement officer of the day. It just goes down the line. It's all the opposite of what justice would be. Okay. So what do you expect of these right-wing Trump-supporting justices? They're going to rule something that's the opposite of what the Constitution says. Okay. Now, after slavery was abolished, of course, white supremacists in the South did not want to end it or their domination of black people. And so they enforced, they overturned Reconstruction, put in Jim Crow, but they also continued this ideology about black women, that black women did not know how to take care of their children, and they weren't interested in their children. There were no real bonds between their children. This was an idea that was promulgated during the slavery era to try to justify taking children away from their black mothers. There's a scene in 12 Years a Slave that is so just imprinted in my memory, where the purchasers of a black woman's children come to the plantation house to take the children away. And the mother is screaming, she's begging, please don't take my child, please don't take my child. And the white mistress of the house says, oh, never mind her, she'll forget about them in a day or so. This idea that we don't really care about our children. And that idea was the main idea behind the welfare queen. And I don't have to say the black welfare queen, because the welfare queen was black, in the 1980s. And I don't have time to go through all the stereotypes that went on in between this idea in the plantation Negro as a free man. One of the points in that book was black women who are now free are incompetent of caring for their children, because their children were only well cared for by enslavers. Again, as I said, the opposite, right? The opposite of reality becomes the truth, or the so-called truth. And that idea was then, over the next century, it continues and finds itself in the idea that black women had babies just to get a welfare check. They didn't want the babies, they just had them, multiple children, with their hyperfertility, to get a welfare check. And then what did they do with the money? They spent it on themselves, on Cadillacs and fur coats, and neglected their children. And this idea was then fueled welfare restructuring, the abolition of the federal guarantee to welfare. This was a powerful idea, and it also fueled the expansion of foster care, because before black people were on the radar of the child welfare system, the formal child welfare system, at first they were ignored by it, because the New Deal and its provision of welfare, that was for white mothers. Not, again, puny amounts, stigmatized, but it was for white mothers. When black mothers began to demand entitlements to welfare, what happened? We get the rule that if you don't have a suitable house, you get kicked off of welfare. And then what happens next? Well, if you're kicked off of welfare, that means you can't take care of your children, so we got to take your children away. And that's when we see the explosion of foster care in the United States. There's no way you can explain how foster care went from a little tiny program, because most federal money went to intact families, until Black people started getting welfare. And then you see a doubling of the foster care population, and you see another doubling of it in the late 1980s, when they started taking children, babies, newborns from Black women who were pregnant and using drugs. Don't tell me that this isn't a racist system. It's a racist, you can see it's a racist system. All you have to do is go in family court and you see that it's racist, because go to family court in Chicago, you only see Black mothers in there pleading for their children. But look at the policies that were implemented, and you can see that they all became more punitive when Black people started to get rights to any form of government assistance. And so both the abolition of the federal guarantee of welfare and the explosion of foster care, I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a minute, all of that was because of the massive influx of Black children into the system, as well as a continuation of the separation of Native children from their families and tribes, a continuation of a military strategy to decimate indigenous people or assimilate them, one or the other. Assimilate them into white culture or destroy their tribes. This also led to massive forced sterilization of Black women, as well as women on the island of Puerto Rico, indigenous women, Mexican origin women right here in California. LA County Hospital had a program of sterilizing Mexican origin women, either immigrants or second generation Mexicans. And this came directly in North Carolina, for example, out of the eugenics era, with the eugenics board operating into the 1970s. But by that time, it was mostly ordering the sterilizations of impoverished Black women. And we know this continues today through exposés of sterilization programs in California prison system. It's gender programmed. That's why you got to be careful when they talk about, oh, we're going to improve prison by having a gender program. Well, what that meant in California was we're going to sterilize the people in the women's prisons, and also in ICE detention camps. And these are what's exposed, but who knows how much more is going. If it's exposed in some places, you know what's going on in other places as well. Now, as all of this is going on, we see this argument that Clarence Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court has advocated both in a prior decision, but in his concurrence in Dobbs, as well as the work of some anti-abortion advocates, putting up posters based on the claim that Black women are committing genocide against our communities by having abortions. And I just want to point out this. I know this is just like, this is too much, right? When does it end? I got more, honey. I got more for you. Okay, so look at that message. The most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. That's the message to sterilize Black women. If our wombs are dangerous, shut them down. Shut them down. So this supposedly was a poster to say we're dangerous because we terminate pregnancies. But the message is entangled with the same message that says we shouldn't be having children at all. And if abortion is dangerous for Black women. What is, that, I say if that, because it isn't, but, if you believe that, then how do you explain what we're already seeing? Black women dying as a result of bans on abortion. And that's not the only way Black women are dying, by being denied medical care when they have tried to have an abortion and need medical assistance, or a miscarriage and need medical assistance that they're denied. But also, in general, Black women have the highest rate of maternal mortality in this nation, which already has an extremely high rate of maternal mortality, higher than any other so-called developed nation, and higher, or I should say, well, actually higher for Black women than many developing nations, I should say. And the maternal mortality rate is going up in the United States. This is shameful. This is shameful, but the women who are suffering the most from it are Black women, and the states that compel pregnant people to give birth are the riskiest for Black people to be pregnant. Now, part of the result of these ideologies about Black women being incompetent to take care of children, and a right-wing strategy to make the fetus more valuable than the living pregnant person. Why? Of course, not because of any care for the fetus or the child that will be born, may be born, but as a method of controlling people's reproductive lives. And that punishment of pregnancy itself for decades has been part of that strategy of reproductive control. It was not just a strategy of punishing people who had abortions. That was deeply entangled with a strategy, it's a unified strategy of punishing people for their conduct, either for their conduct during pregnancy or for not giving birth to a healthy baby. But it's not just not giving birth to, because you could give birth to a healthy baby and still be punished if you did something while you were pregnant that the prosecutor said was risky for a fetus. So you're being punished for putting a fetus at risk, whether you have the baby, whether the baby is stillborn, whether you have a miscarriage, or whether you terminate the pregnancy. It can all be punished. Can all be punished. And this began in the late 1980s with the prosecutions of Black women who were pregnant and used crack cocaine. The stereotype of the crack baby that was supposed to be this monstrous baby, for some reason, only Black women gave birth to babies that were irreparably damaged from drug use, and irreparably damaged in a particular way. It wasn't just a medical problem, it was that they lacked social consciousness. So crack was supposed to deprive Black women of maternal instinct. This is literally what was written in medical journals and media articles, deprived Black women of maternal instinct, and then they gave birth to babies who were deprived of social consciousness. Somehow this only happened with Black people. That then, after those prosecutions, led to a more wide-scale criminalization of pregnancy, with Regina McKnight in 2001 being convicted of homicide by child abuse for a stillbirth. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, suspended to 12 years. She'd already served time. And then she spent 8 years in prison for a stillbirth. before she was released, when finally she got a good lawyer who showed that her prior lawyer didn't challenge adequately the phony evidence that she caused the stillbirth. All right. So legal theories that were used to prosecute Black women then set the stage for widespread criminalization of fetal harm. And the fetal personhood movement developed this unified strategy of criminalizing pregnancy and abortion, and more prosecutions for either one. Now, when I said that this is what was going to happen if Roe v. Wade was overturned and we continue to have this fetal personhood campaign going on, approved by the courts, even by the U.S. Supreme Court, that women would be jailed for miscarriages. And there was this backlash by anti-abortion advocates saying that one was that people like me lose our composure entirely, succumbing to outlandish, feverish fantasies pulled from the wildest corners of their minds. Okay, because it used to be that these anti-abortion advocates didn't want people to know that people would be imprisoned for their reproductive decisions. Now they don't care. They're like, lock them up. Well, there was a time when they thought that would turn people against them. And we're now in a state where criminalizing is in vogue. And so they don't care anymore. But you know what? I was right. And many of us were right. What happened? As soon as Dobbs was overturned, we see an increase in criminalizing pregnancy outcomes, including what was recently reported by Pregnancy Justice, that there have been more than 200 criminalizations related to pregnancy since Dobbs was decided, and these will only expand. Okay, now, what's the answer, according to the U.S. Supreme Court and anti-abortion advocates, for the harms of compelling people to give birth? We'll adopt your baby. That's the answer. This has long been a supposed solution that anti-abortion advocates have held out as the remedy for these reproductive harms. And in the Dobbs decision, Justice Alito actually wrote, now he's quoting anti-abortion advocates, but without any kind of criticism, that a woman who puts her newborn up for adoption today has little reason to fear that the baby will not find a suitable home. And then he has the nerve to drop a footnote talking about the high demand for adoptable babies, and that the domestic supply of infants relinquished at birth or within the first month of life and available to be adopted had virtually become non-existent. So according to the U.S. Supreme Court, there's this win-win situation where if you're forced to give birth to a baby, you just surrender the baby, and you'll escape all the burdens of parenting, and then you will help to meet this unfulfilled demand for adoptable babies. So this is just a well-functioning market for babies that the Supreme Court envisions for our reproductive lives. Now, first of all, it's absurd because it completely ignores the experience of being pregnant against your will and giving birth to a baby that you were not prepared for whatever reason. It doesn't matter what your reason is, whatever reason. It's your body, it's your life, whatever reason. It completely ignores that. But for our purposes, what's really it ignores is that this is not a free market transaction where everybody wins. The availability of foster children, because that's what those children are going to become. You're giving up custody of your child when you put them at the safe haven drop. But forget that. That's not what. Nobody does that. Very few people do that. We know that. What's going to happen is your baby's going to be taken from you. Just like they took Saisha Mercado's baby. Just like they took the babies I know of many people in this room. That's what's going to happen to the babies. And it's not a win-win situation. It completely ignores that this is a system that relies on coercion and surveillance and terror against families. That rosy picture of adoption is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's again, opposite of reality. Opposite of reality. And just to explain these images here, one is a group of child welfare investigators in Arizona that created T-shirts emblazoned with the message, "Professional Kidnappers." Yes, that's what the shirt says, "Professional Kidnappers." Literally, professional kid, if I could blow it up, but you could, "Professional Kidnappers" on the front, and the back, as I recall, says, "Do you know where your children are? Because they may have been taken by us." Yes, it's taunting, because they know that's what they are. Like it's supposed to be a joke, but a joke is meaningless unless it has some reality behind it. And they know that's how people think about them, and you're right. Whoever said that's taunting, that is taunting the people whose children have been taken from them. Yes, yes, and they're brazen about it. Now, they ended up being fired because they were stupid enough to put it on social media. And then we also have JMAC for Families poster in Harlem reminding us that they separate children at the border of Harlem too. Okay, I'm going to move on. I said a little bit about the roots of family policing in slavery, in the mass removal of black children after the Civil War ended, through the apprenticeship system, which was a court-ordered system. So judges were doing this during the end of Reconstruction. It was part of demolishing Reconstruction to put black children back into the forced servitude of former enslavers. And indigenous boarding schools coming out of the military use of child removal as a weapon, a literal weapon of war. Carceral policies that are entangled. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act in 1994, expanding police presence in black communities and prison populations, prisons locking people up, caging people. I've mentioned the end of the federal guarantee to welfare, and then a year later, the Adoption Safe Families Act that dealt with the mass mushrooming of the foster population, mostly with black children. Black children were the largest group of children in foster care at the time this law was passed, and this was explicitly designed. What do we do about all these black children? The answer wasn't send them home to their families, stop taking them from their families. The answer was speed up termination of their black mothers' rights and put them into adoptive homes, preferably white people's homes. Literally, that's what advocates for this law were saying. And it passed under a Democratic Congress and signed by a Democratic president. The carceral logic behind all of this is that harms to children are seen as maltreatment by their parents caused by parental pathology in need of therapeutic cures, instead of the massive harms to children of this nation are caused by structural inequities, white supremacy, racism, sexism, classism, poverty, discrimination against people with disabilities. All this is why children are harmed in this nation. Instead of doing something about that, the government says, and the ideology of care in this nation says, no, it's the fault of their parents, so the answer is to take them away from their parents. So this is a way to impede the radical social change that we need in this nation to actually meet the needs of children and their families. Now, criminalizing fetal abuse is going to expand, already has expanded, the grounds for family separation, because fetal neglect is now evidence of parental unfitness. You see how all this is tying together, right? Compelling people to give birth, criminalizing pregnancy, family police, they're all tied together. Expanding, each one expands the other. Each one expands the other. And this is enforced by so-called mandated reporters, like the hospital staff that turned in Saisha Mercado, that instead of giving support to people, think about it, again, this way of just pathologically twisting what reality should be. You take the professionals who are supposedly trained to care for children, teachers and doctors and nurses and other hospital staff and social workers, and tell them, no, don't care for children. Turn them into an agency where somebody who's completely unprepared to care for children is going to deal with their needs. It's the opposite. It's like making Matt Gaetz the attorney general, right? It's that you take why would you do that? It makes no sense unless you don't care about those children, and the purpose of the whole system is to oppress them, is to control them, is to push them into another system, the criminal legal system. All right, and tons of evidence that these mandated reporters are biased. They're biased against people who are impoverished. They're biased against Black people, Indigenous people. Okay. A pregnancy justice report found that in many of these cases, the majority of these cases, the family policing system was involved in these prosecutions, these criminalizations of pregnancy. All right, as I said, my purpose was to give the foundation for how these forms of reproductive injustice are deeply entangled. I'm over time. I'm just going to say a few words because this is what the rest of this convening is all about, okay? That reproductive justice, the framework of reproductive justice from the very beginning, its very first articulation in the 1990s, was that it includes the human right not to have a child, but also to have children and to parent your children in a safe, supported, sustainable community. So it has always, from the beginning, encompassed all this. Sometimes some people who talk about reproductive justice forget that. Come on, you know that reproductive justice organizations have not taken up family policing and barely criminalization of pregnancy. Okay, so if you go back and read the original documents that Black women originally put out there, and it has always included all of these aspects of reproductive justice. Now, I, working in against family policing since the end of the 1990s, I went through decades of thinking that I could work toward reforming this system and making it less harmful. I admit that. That was a mistake, but I learned quickly, especially after I worked for 9 years on this expert panel to try to fix foster care in Washington State, where a judge found it was violating the constitutional rights. Are you from Washington? Yeah. All right. Violating the constitutional rights of children in foster care. I won't go down the litany of problems that they were putting on these children in Washington State. The named plaintiff, it was a Brahm class action lawsuit. She had been moved over 30 times while she was in foster care. But the problem with this, as much as I said, what about the parents? What about the parents? They were not interested, even I have to say, the plaintiff's attorneys, they were not interested in what the parents had to say. It was all about how do we help the foster parents to take care of these children? How do we train them better? How do we give them respite care? How do we, reduce the caseworkers' loads? All of this kind of thing. And no, let's have a survey of the foster parents. What about the parents of these children? No interest in, guess what? We could solve this by stop taking those children and putting them in this horrible foster care system. No. Nobody was interested in that. So we spent 7 years. It's only supposed to be 7 years. We spent 2 more years, 9 years, and we just had to give up. We had to give up. Runaways. The state's position was, why are these bad children running away? I said, well, did you ever think that maybe they're running away because your system is bad? Right? We did not make a dent in the problem of runaways from the foster system. Okay, because the whole focus was bad. It became clear to me, as long as you have a system that is designed to oppress people, that is absolutely dependent on terrorizing people. You don't have a family policing system if you don't terrorize families. That's what it operates on. It doesn't come and say, how can we help you? It says, we have accused you, we've investigated you, we're going to look for something to charge you with, and now we're going to punish you, and you're going to do what we say, or you're going to lose your children and not get your children back. That's how it operates. It doesn't operate any other way. As long as it operates like that, it cannot be fixed because its harm is what it's designed to do. So I finally came to that conclusion. I know many of you have come to that much faster than I did. I may be a genius, but I'm not. But seriously, the only reason I could do anything I do, anything I write, anything I advocate for, anything that MacArthur Fellowship praised me for, I only could do it because I worked alongside the parents whose children have been taken from them. I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have even understood this system if I didn't do that. So, I'm just grateful for that award. I'm just grateful that when they said why I got it, they said it's because I affirmed the voices of the people who are locked into these horrible systems. And that's what I'm grateful for. So, all right. And okay, I'm gonna wrap it up now. So, what do we have to do? We have to reimagine the very meaning of care and safety. And we're already doing it in multiple ways in our protests against when children are taken, in ending mandated reporting, in mutual aid, in ending the womb to foster care pipeline with involuntary drug testing, and so many ways. Transformative justice. I wish I had more room on here because there's so many people here I could put up on that slide, but you know who you are. And so, in conclusion, as I said at the beginning, recognizing that these forms of reproductive injustice are inextricably entangled means that our movements to end them have to also be inextricably entangled. And if we recognize that the movement to end family policing, the movement for safe, available to everyone for any reason abortions, the movement to end punishment of pregnancy, the movement for birth justice, for Black midwives having the ability to care for people in their communities, the movement to end the prison industrial complex. If we recognize that those are all entangled, that we have a common vision, and that we should be in solidarity with each other, imagine how stronger, and I think this room shows it, our vision, our work will be. And so let us work together to create a world where the idea that you can make children safer and healthier by separating their families, that you can meet human needs by caging people, by tearing apart their families, by prosecuting them for miscarriages. All of that would be totally unimaginable And instead, we have a society that is truly based in caring and love and our equal humanity. So thank you so much. I think I've just lost my voice. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.